Thank you for your interest in applying for a Parks and Recreation Trust Fund grant. In this guide to prepare your PARTF application, we're reviewing projects with land acquisition. So this covers the documents that are required when you're requesting funds to purchase a property, but this also includes donated property. So you might not be purchasing it, but you're acquiring property. So the questions we're looking at is in this video section will be to review the process for land acquisition through PARTF. What are the steps and timeline to take title to the property, which is very important. What if someone donates the property to our community? How is that incorporated with your application process? And what do we need to know about the legal or other documentation required of the application or after the grant is awarded? So there are certain methods to acquire property. First is fee simple, which is the outright purchase for fair market value. The price is based on a recent appraisal. A bargain sale is when a property owner agrees to sell the land at a price below fair market value. The amount of that difference between the selling price and the fair market value or appraised value is the donation and can be used as a match. Donation of property is when the current owner deeds the property over to your town, city, or county. The donor must be a private individual or organization, so it cannot come from another, like a state agency or a school system. It must be a private individual or organization, and the value of the property is established by an appraisal, and that may be used as a match, the full amount in that case. So if it's a required donation, a lot of people ask this, so say the land is conveyed to the city due to a statute or rule, sometimes references land dedication. This is not eligible as a donation as an acceptable match. Part of funds can certainly be used to develop recreation facilities on these type of properties as long as the local government obtains title or long-term lease for at least 25 years of the land. But that is not a donation that you can use as part of your match. So other important notes on taking title of land. Number one is do not take ownership of the property prior to the project period. So remember, the project period begins once the contract is signed. There's usually a date on that contract that's the start of your project period. You cannot take ownership prior to that time. So typically a contract, so if you're applying for a grant, the grant cycle opens in October, it could be the next November. So it could be a full year later before the project period begins at minimum. So similarly, all eligible expenses for PARTF must occur during the project period. So after a grant is awarded and the contract is signed is when those expenses, so purchasing the land. Now there are some property costs like appraisals and things that may be included, but you need to include them in your cost estimates for that. So there are some things prior to the project period, as long as you include them in your cost estimates that you submit for the grant, could be eligible, including the appraisal for the property. So just make sure you look at that when you review the cost estimates and documents, and don't forget that you may include those as an eligible expense. Taking title prior to a grant award and contract means that the property expense has occurred, and therefore the cost or the value, if it's donated, is ineligible for PARTF. So you want to make sure you follow these steps. So if it's donated property, again, that's considered an expense because the transfer of title has taken place. So if the title's already been transferred, the value of property may not be used as a match. If you've already owned it now, just apply for a development grant. Also, if you think there's donated property, please reach out to your RRS consultant and discuss those items. So requirements for your application are that you need to include the estimated value of the property, a legal description of the land, acquisition boundary map and a concept site plan, and we'll look at that in just a moment, list of the properties to be acquired, a history of conveyance of any land that has been donated, And also consider improvements on the property. So we'll talk about that as well. So are there buildings that are already on the property that you're getting ready to acquire or that's being donated? What will happen to them? Do they have a recreational purpose? Sometimes you may be donated a site that has ball fields on it. So let's look at that. So the first one is property value. An appraisal must be completed by a licensed North Carolina appraiser. This certifies that the appraisal was done using the Universal Standard of Professional Appraisal Practices. It must follow those guidelines. And you will need to provide 2 copies of the appraisal, 1 copy and 1 original. That should be submitted with your application. However, when you're preparing your grant application, you can include tax value as you estimate the value. However, just please keep in mind that if you are funded, an appraisal is required, and the state property office will use that appraised value. Tax value is not a reliable evaluation, so ultimately an appraisal is needed. But we do realize that some communities may not want to pay for an appraisal unless they get funded. So you can use the tax value in the application, but we do warn against that. You can greatly underestimate or overestimate what the actual value is, which would change up your budget. So we advise you to be cautious on that. So going back to the property value, if the property is valued at over $500,000, you are required to have 2 appraisals done. And the state property office will review both to determine what the fair market value of the property is that can be used in the grant application. PARTF funds may only go towards property purchased at or below fair market value. So if you pay more than fair market value, it will only cover the fair market value. If your application is funded, you will be responsible for paying any cost overruns for items that you underestimated in your project budget. So make sure your request is as close to the actual value as possible. An additional tip is, what is the date of the appraisal that you have? If you're using tax value of the property, when was the last reval done? Is the seller's asking price at a reasonable range? So we just want to make sure that money is being spent cautiously as you use taxpayer funds. So legal description of the land. This is meets and bounds survey, or sometimes called a plat map. There's an example over here to the right. So make sure you have 2 copies of that. The map element should include a project title, acreage, the north arrow, a scale bar, and the date prepared. Also, the legal description includes this reference deed and page, and when it was recorded. So this allows someone to know exactly where this property is, to go back and document that. Are there easements or restrictions on public use of the property? Make sure that is referenced on here. We also want to know what the adjacent property use is, and if there's any significant reference point. So that could be anything from major streets or highways, landmarks, benchmark coordinates, iron stakes, things that surveyors have and use as reference points. So make sure you have that information. The boundary map and concept plan. Again, we talked about the boundary map. The concept plan, you need to submit 20 copies of each, and also use the required color coding to illustrate the proposal. You want to include the site boundaries, proposed use of the property, and remember, the conceptual or concept plan is not a final master plan that will be built, but this gives the authority an idea of the proposed park development. You want them to understand, what you're proposing to do and how that is compatible with the location and types of recreation that the land can support. So here's an example. This was an existing park. You can see where everything is located, the property boundaries. Here's some yellow. You have the easements. There's a Duke Power easement through here. But they were acquiring land adjacent to the park, so expanding the park. So this whole area is in green because that's what they're asking for funds for. And in this particular example, they were acquiring 209 acres, but they're not building anything on it. At this time, everything is future development, so it's color coded in orange. But this clearly would show the Park Authority members when they look at this that they're going to expand the trail system, how that connects, that there'll be a campground, what will be, access down at the river. So this is the type of plan that you may include. You also need to include a list of all the properties that you're acquiring. Sometimes it's more than one parcel, so it might be multiple parcels. So you want to complete this for each parcel. You'll have the payment type. There's 4 options. You want to have the current owner name, the parcel info, so the acreage and parcel number, the estimated value, so this section of the land, and if you may not have improvements, it might just be property that you're not going to use, but if there's improvements that you will use for public park purposes, say you've been donated property that has a building on it that you're going to use as a community center, then you need to have the estimated value of that. So make sure that's in your appraisal as well. And that's only those existing improvements if they're going to be used for public recreation. And then you total that for the proposed purchase price. So remember, the property will be either purchased, donated, if it's required donation, which again has different rules down here, or a bargain sale. So include all those. And please, as you prepare this, share it with your RRS consultant, and they can make sure everything is filled out correctly in case you have questions. So another important requirement for land acquisition is if the land is being donated, you must provide a history of conveyance, copies of the deeds from the past 5 years. So that's very important. So make sure you include that portion. A deed restriction, so know that once it's purchased, you will have to dedicate the property in public recreational use in perpetuity. So that's different than building facilities, which is a 25-year requirement. If you purchase land with PARTF, it will be dedicated for public recreation use forever. So that will need to be recorded, or that restriction will need to be placed with the deed. In the PARTF program, we can provide the exact language to record on the deed depending on if it was purchased or donated or if it is an easement. So again, your RRS consultant can provide those examples for you. But keep that in mind as you take title to the land, that information will need to be on there. So that's something to know at closing. Also know that if you're planning for just to acquire land and you're not doing any development, you will need to provide access within 5 years of the purchase date. Do you have an urgent need to take title of the property? So if you need to acquire this property before a contract is signed, remember that it's almost a 1-year time frame. Say the owner wants to sell it immediately before the end of the calendar year, or if there's sometimes it's part of an estate. There is a way to have a waiver process. So a waiver of retroactivity will permit the purchase, either the value or even donated, purchase of that property as an eligible PARTF expense that took place before the contract was signed. But you must have this waiver in place prior to the transfer of property. So contact your regional consultant if this scenario applies. The waiver request must be in writing on letterhead. The request must document the urgency. So why do you need to purchase this right away before a grant is awarded? And then it does go to the Park Authority or the State Parks Office for approval. The waiver does not provide any preference or guarantee that the grant will be awarded. In fact, the Parks Authority will not know that you had this waiver in place. The waiver is good for 24 months, so that actually gives you 2 grant cycles. So if you don't get funded in the current grant cycle, there's a chance, if it's still in that 24-month period, you could come back next year and apply again and still have the value of that land as an eligible expense. Thank you. That's all for video forward acquisition. And again, if you have any questions, please reach out to your RRS consultant, and we wish you the best in your application process.